Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about shape key animations, or as I want to call them, for the letter K, keyframed shape animations. So I can cheat and have something for letter K that I've used in my workflow before. Technically, it's just a bunch of shapes that you can keyframe and reshape and modify. I've never really used this before except for this project. So if you look through my entire feed on Instagram, I don't think you'll find anything that I've used shape keys for before. So the only example I have is this project. But because I've used it on multiple shapes, I have an understanding of how it works. And I've tested it before, but never really put it in a project. As an overview, it's simply a way to keyframe the changing of shape in edit mode. So whatever changes you make to a mesh in edit mode, you can keyframe. And then those keyframes are going to show the transition from one shape to another. So a morphing animation, basically. If you type morphing animations in After Effects, you can actually see what is happening. You modify the vertices of any shape to make them into a new shape. But there are some limitations with it that I've found when I used it with my project. And I'll talk about this later in the video. The best way to learn anything is with an example, so let's start creating. Let's add a circle, because to me that's the easiest one to modify. And let's go to top view and open the add circle settings. So we can change the vertices to something like 16. And I want to keep the number of vertices even just because of what I want to create right now, because I want to select every other point. And I'll have to go to edit mode, fill it with F. So I have a fill. I could have done that in the add circle, but I forgot. But that's okay. If you want to fill vertices with a face, just hit F and it should fill it with a face. I'm not going to extrude it, but you can definitely extrude it. However, if you do that, you'll have to toggle X-ray mode so you can select the points behind it. So you're not just selecting the front point like here. I'm going to undo that just because I don't want to worry about the points in the back. I just want to show you how keyframe animation work. Now that I have my shape, I can go to the object data properties. And this is where you're going to find shape keys. So they're under the vertex group. We've used vertex groups before, and now we're going to use shape keys. The first thing you're going to do is add a base, or as they call it, basis, and you can remove the relative. This is dependent on what you're trying to create. I'm going to keep it as is, and we can change it later to see how it affects the animation. And then I'm going to add another one. So this is key 1. Whatever the value over here is going to be the transition from the basis to key 1. So 0 is going to keep it at the basis, and then 1 is going to transition it to key 1. Right now, I'm going to keep it at 0. It doesn't really matter. You can definitely try and put it over here to see the transition. But I'm going to start at 0 and then just edit. But you have to select the key and then hit tab to go into edit mode and change whatever you want to change for this. So what I'm going to do is select all with A. And then I'm going to go here, select, checker, deselect. And this will select every other point for me. And now I can scale these points. With checker deselect, you have options. So if you don't like what is being selected, you can definitely offset the selection. It doesn't matter for me because what I'm trying to create isn't really something that is affected by which points, since I'm using a circle. And then you can also do 2. So every 2 points, which is going to affect the way this is being selected just because it's an even number. So for me, 1 and then 1. And I also offset the entire thing by 1 just so I get the corner points or the points on the axes, the X and Y axes. But again, it doesn't matter. And now I'm going to edit this. So let's hit S for scale. And I'm going to scale these two, make it look like a sun or something. And then we can also select everything, hit Command B and choose vertices. We can clamp overlap and add segments. And now we have them more rounded. Hold shift if you want to control how you're scaling up and down, the values I mean. Now this is where the limitations come in. So if I get out of edit mode, you can see this is happening, and I think this is because of the bevel. So if I undo the bevel, we don't see those edges coming out or those points coming out. So I can go to the modifiers, subdivision surface, and let's try adding the bevel over here. Okay, that's better. So if you add it in the modifiers tab, it looks better because we're using shape keys. So that's one of the limitations that I found when I wanted to add a few edits on the circle or any other shape, like bevel, for instance. So now the edit of the shape is very simple, and so it doesn't really affect any of the shape keys. And now if I go back to the object data properties and I change the value here for key 1 from 0 to 1, I can actually see the transition, which is really, really cool. And what I did is add a keyframe for the first one, and then add another keyframe at 20, change the value to 1, insert a keyframe, and now we have a transition happening. And what I did with my project for the book review, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, is that I added a different interpolation mode. So what I did, I think either bounce or elastic. Let's try bounce. I think it's bounce, yeah. And bounce changes based on how many frames are in between your keyframes. So if I pull this to the 10th frame and animate this, you're going to see that it's much faster. So bounce and elastic won't show that well unless you have enough frames in between your keyframes. So if I pull this right here, you can see the transition for the bounce. Let's try it also for elastic. It's much faster. So let's see if I put it at 50, how that changes the interpolation mode. You can see it's more elasticy, but with the other one, bounce, it's more towards the end. I like bounce the most, and I like it with at least 20 frames, depending on how dramatic you want it to look. And you can also add one more. So let's say I want to add another key. Now go into edit mode, and because it's relative to the basis, it's going to change based on the initial animation. So let's deselect with checker deselect, but this time let's make the offset at 0 and let's scale it inward. And now at 40, let's add keyframe at 1, but then we're gonna have to add a 0 keyframe at the beginning. So now we have 0, 1 for the key 1 and then 0, 1 for key 2. And you can see the change. Also the transition for the other two, the interpolation I mean, isn't bounce, so it was a little bit smoother. So let's put it at bounce. Okay, so with absolute, if I remove relative, you're gonna see a change in the way those keys are set. So it's going to be the basis at 0, and then key 1 is going to be at value 10, and then key 2 is at value 20. So this is the evolution time. So if I add a keyframe for evolution time, insert a keyframe, and then 10 for the 20th frame, and then for the 40th frame, we're gonna have it at 20. And now we can actually see the transition, but it's not relative to the basis. So you can see this getting much smaller than when it was relative. So when it was relative, because it was relative to the basis, those points didn't really change. Okay, my mistake. Absolute is actually changing from the basis. So the basis was this. So this is where everything is. So if you look at where this point lies, it's on the 10th point from the left, or from the 0 on the x-axis, because it's 1 meter when you start creating most of the object. And so that's 10 squares of these. So if you notice how it changes, if I go into key 1, then what I did is those points on the axes is what I scaled up with the other points that are one after it. And then key 2 is when I selected those inner points and scaled them down. And this went back to the basis. So absolute is what's relative to the basis, but relative, if I go out of edit mode, relative is what's relative to the previous point. So I switched the two concepts before. To reiterate, relative is relative to the previous point. So it's going from 0 to 1, and that's key 1 relative to the basis, and then key 2 is relative to key 1. So if I go to edit mode for this one, this is the basis. Pay attention to where this point is on the x-axis, and then key 1 is going to scale this up, and then key 2 is going to scale it down. If I go out now, we can see the difference. So in edit mode, they're all going to stay the same, but in object mode, you're going to actually see the change, transitioning relatively to the previous point. So depending on how you want your shape morphing animation, you're going to have to select or deselect the relative. Another thing I did with this project is that I combined the shape keys with physics simulation. So I used rigid bodies for these with a collider. The collider was rigid at passive, and this was rigid at active. With rigid body, it's a different system than with the cloth simulation. So with cloth simulation, if you want it to collide with an object, you'll have to add collision to that object. But if you're using rigid body, then this is going to be the active because it's what I want to move. And if I have a box or a cube and I remove the front face and I just want it to be the collider and add a rigid body with passive. So passive is not going to move basically. And you can also animate it and select animated if you're trying to animate this and move the inside with it. Also, you can have this as box for the shape or the collision. And this can be a cylinder for the shape of the collision, or you can just put it at mesh and keep it as active because I want it to move. And now if I run this, it's going to go crazy because rigid body animations are not the greatest. I just go over here and increase the steps. So I'll just try 60. So this will make the calculation better, but it's going to be slower. Let's also solidify this. Maybe put it after the subdivision. Let's try that. Make it a little bit larger. If I isolate it so I can see what is happening. And you can change the offset to 0, so it's scaling from the middle. And again, we're gonna have to go to this. You can also change the sensitivity of the collision to 0.001, and the same for this. Sometimes it doesn't really work unless you have mesh for all of them, but even then it's still penetrating the box. I also have a lot of problems with the rigid body when it comes to cache. It doesn't really reset the cache that easily, and it gets to a point where I have to delete the entire rigid body world and add it all over again. The only thing I was able to get for this one is this. But technically, I do remove the collider. I don't really care about seeing it, and so it's going to look as if it's hitting something or falling into something, but it's not going to show that it's going out of that object. And also, one of the things that you have to pay attention to is to check the deforming in the collision settings, because this object is actually deforming. And what you need to play around with is the speed over here and the sub-steps per frame and the solver iterations. And to reset the cache, I sometimes just remove the rigid body from the object and then reapply it, redefine everything, and now I have a new empty cache. That makes the collision sometimes a lot better, and you can actually see it better, so it's not going out. And one thing also to note is that I am in top view, so if I rotate both of these to the front view so the gravity actually works, I can just rotate it by 90 degrees on the x-axis, and now we're gonna have to just remove it and fix the speed maybe. Okay, I figured out what I did. It's just adding a face to the cube. So technically not removing the face because that will make it fly away if it hits the collider. And because I'm going to hide the cube, or I hid the cube in my project, it didn't really matter that it was colliding because no one was seeing what it was colliding with. And if you want to see it, you can either do the wireframe shading, or you can go to the object over here, or object properties, go to viewport display and display as bounds. So this way you're only seeing the bounds of the object, and this is exactly what I did in my project. Also, I did flip the normals for this one, but because it's not now textured, let's bring it back textured. The inside is actually blue because usually the collision is much better on the blue side of a normal. And so I always flip it. Even with collision over here, you can just say check or uncheck the single-sided. So you have both sides to collide with because it's always bad collision with the red side of the normal. And now if I go back to bounds, now from the front view, this looks nice because I wanted them to look like explosions. And so I didn't really care that much about how they were exploding. I wanted the key shape animation to change from whatever shapes I had a half circle, and then to kind of resemble an explosion because of what the book talks about. And you can definitely check the split impulse and reduce the speed to maybe 0.5. But because the cache isn't resetting and maybe I'm not really typing in the right settings, it's not very slow, but I think I slowed down the speed even more in my initial project. So the transition for the actual animation or the shape animation is much faster than the actual speed of the rigid body simulation. This doesn't matter. You can definitely try it with cloth simulations. So follow the previous tutorial with this one and see how it affects your cloth simulation when you're changing the shape with shape keys. Now, rigid body simulation or any simulation doesn't really matter. I just wanted to tell you that you can definitely combine a few things with shape keys, just like you did with vertex groups. And again, I don't use shape keys that often just because I don't really have many uses for it, but I'm 100% sure that you might have ideas of morphing shapes, or maybe it's your style to morph shapes or objects. Also, another note is that shape keys have limitations when it comes to the number of vertices as well. Whatever number of vertices you start with, you have to end with. So if you suddenly decide to add a bunch of vertices in your key 1 or key 2 transition, when you go back to the basis, you're going to find that they were added, and sometimes they cause a little bit of deformity in your initial shape. I've done that in my project. That's how I knew that you have to stick with the same number of vertices. And yeah, that's all I know about shape keys and how to morph one shape into another. If you have any tips for me, or if you have any notes on how to use shape keys for others to learn, then please leave them in the comments. And it's time for me to sign off. See you next week. Bye.